Dear friends, hello everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to another event by the Economic Strategy Center. I think today it's the third or fourth time when we present our macroeconomic forecast by non-governmental Ukrainian expert, leading private sector and think tank analysts who are here to present the macroeconomic forecast for the year 2024-2025 on how our economy, prices and exchange rates are about to change. We have also invited governmental representatives and our international colleagues to also share their opinions, and we hope that together we will have a perfect chance to discuss the future of Ukrainian economy. This event is arranged as part of the Good Governance Fund, Economic Hub and Enhancement of Financial Stability project, and we still appreciate the support of the United Kingdom. Uh, Support. It's implemented by the global, and yes, I'm always done with how. So if you want to listen in Ukrainian, please just listen to main audio channel. So during today event, we're about to present a forecast for 2024 and a little of 2025 by 7 leading Ukrainian and foreign analytical teams, and maybe to listen to feedback by the National Bank and our other colleagues, and then we will have a little time for discussion and questions from the audience. So now I will share my screen so you can take a look at the forecast by our economist. Unfortunately, I'm really sorry. For some reason, I cannot share my screen. We have some technical. Oh, hey, now it works. I hope you can see it now.
Не в режимі показу. Супер.
Okay, I hope now you can see it. So the slides will be in English, but you will have a chance to download Ukrainian translation at the Center for Economic Strategies website, and the same is true for English version. The recording of our event will be also available on our website. So we have asked our traditional experts to join this forecast. I highly appreciate my colleagues. It's Concorde Capital, Dragon Capital, WIIW, Forbes, Institute for Economic Research and Policy Consulting, who together with German economic team also prepares the forecasts, ICU and Oxford Economics. These are the analysts who have tracked the Ukrainian macroeconomy for many years, simulated our economy for many years, and today we will have a chance to listen to their opinions. So let me really briefly present the key changes in the forecast for 2024 as compared to our previous event. As you remember, our previous annual forecast was done in December 2023. For GDP growth, then we have quite a high variance. Now it's lower, but our analyst forecasts lower increase than in December. I think it depends on many factors, and the authors of this forecast will have a chance to share it in more details. The same is true for inflation forecast. There is more certainty now, so we expect significantly lower inflation than in December, half year ago. Average forecast, average inflation forecast is 8% lower, and average real GDP growth forecast is around 3.1 level. Very interesting results we have for forecasting budget gap and financing needs, because in December the budget gap slightly increased as compared with previous forecasts, but at the same time the hryvnia exchange rate is expected to increase higher, to get bigger. So basically, the budget gap in dollars is almost unchanged. The same is true for financing needs also. They have increased slightly, but the interesting thing here is that our optimists who in last December forecasted the financial needs at a lower level now have increased their estimate to average level, so the average between optimistic and average level has decreased. There is no variance. Ukraine is expected to need between 50 and 60 billion US dollars in order to cover its budget needs for this years. Let me remind you that these needs all include funding the large budget gap, and here we deliberately remove grants because grants are also parts of financing. And this financing needs also includes debt repayment installments because we also need money to cover these payments. Also, as for foreign aid, in our we see that this certainly has increased over the 6 months. This forecast haven't changed much, but still there is a significant gap between financial needs and foreign aids. On the average is 17 billion. It's actually something we are supposed to cover from internal market. It's GDP funding and other things. Public debt guaranteed by Ukrainian government in, 20, in late 2024 will most likely not exceed 100% of GDP, and according to different estimates, it will be 24-25% of GDP. So it's for public and publicly guaranteed debt. All analysts agree on it. As for hryvnia year exchange rate, here we have quite similar forecasts, around 40 hryvnias per $1. It's average annual foreign exchange rate expected and slightly above 40 hryvnias by the end of the year. So it will be really moderate decline. This decline will happen in the background of significant deterioration of current account forecasts. So here we see significant gap. This gap it's not reducing like previous graphs, though, but it's increasing. So uncertainty over the last 6 months has increased, mostly due to foreign trade. And as for reserves, the forecasts haven't changed much, and the analysts believe that the National Bank will not be forced to sell many United States dollars from reserves and from international proceeds, and so it will be sufficient to maintain safely high level. It's very interesting that this time we have also changed some of our assumptions, which are in the core of our forecasts. If previously the key assumptions were related to the port operation and grain initiative, now most analysts mostly focus on energy issue, how Ukraine is going to survive this winter. So our assumptions are that all 100% of all our analysts assume that the war will last throughout 2024, fortunately, and all of them rely on the assumption that the seaports will be functional throughout the year. So we assume that the GDP forecast in these papers is based on assumption of seaport operation. If we don't have seaport operations, the situation will be different. And as usual, you can bring our victory closer by the night into Oleka. Oleka is saving lives by supplying tactical medicines to the front line. And now let's start with our presentations to have a better understanding of forecasts by my expert colleagues, whom whom I hope to start discussion with right now. Right now, I will stop sharing my screen, and I would like to give floor to Mr. Oleksiy Blinov. It's really interesting. Blinov now presents Forbes Ukraine, and he is watching these trends, not just macroeconomist and macroforecaster, but also as a journalist and mass media representative. So let's take a look at the changes of our macroeconomic landscape. Oleksiy, what do you think? Has the forecasting become less challenging or more difficult? Yes, indeed. I'm in a dual role today as a macroeconomist and as an observer. But now I would like to focus on my first role. How can we summarize this picture and these changes we are observing in the macroeconomic forecast landscape? The most obvious trend is the most obvious thing is that maybe the colleagues will later tell in more detail, but if previously this factor of war was expected to last for 1 year, but now we consider this war assumptions as something unlimited in time, because experience of recent years indicates this attitude to be more feasible. Unfortunately, Ukrainians have been quite nervous because of this short-term approach by our Western partners, short-term approach to these challenges. And now I believe that many people don't know for how many years this war will last. But now we use more congruent approach to this forecast, so we can focus on the best case scenario. The second thing is the state finance. You see, all this discussion here is concentrated around one key topic, the meaning of these figures for state finance. And we take a look at the current forecast plan about the budget gap in this year. Almost everyone expect this current budget gap mentioned in the law. The state budget of Ukraine for 2024 will be significantly exceeded. So in the nearest months, we should expect a review of the state budget plans. As for funding, let me share a little bit of my perspective. As a forecaster and analyst, we all know that there is a significant gap, which even if we review the budget gap will still be significant. So when we talk about funding it from internal market resources, we need to understand that the internal market is not limitless. And so this gap also include a real actual gap, resources which, based on conservative assumptions, will not be covered by foreign funding. So according to my forecast, even in 2024, we have a certain uncovered amount of approximately 200 billion hryvnias. If we talk about 2025, then this amount will be probably much higher. But for now, it's too early to estimate all external proceeds, but it can be 4 times higher. So it will be really interesting for me to hear the perspective of my colleagues. How do they see these gap and the tasks, the challenges Ukraine needs to overcome in order to further mobilize external funding? Thank you so much, Oleksiy. It's indeed a very good question, and I think we will have a chance to ask it later to the Ministry of Finance. We have Mr. Roman Lysenko from the Ministry of Finance. We hope that he will be able to respond to it. And for now, I would like to focus more on macroeconomic forecast and ask my colleagues to go a bit deeper into this forecast, its methods and factors affecting each component of what I have just shown on the screen. Let's start with economic growth. The interesting thing here is that economic forecast by our non-governmental analysts, and let me remind you, 3.5% of the GDP is an average forecast. It matches the average figure expected by the Ministry of Economy, the International Monetary Fund, and the National Bank of Ukraine. So there are no significant differences here in the visions by governmental and non-governmental forecaster. Now, Ms. Dubly, the expert of Economic Research Institute, could you please comment on the GDP growth, factors, risks, and your vision of it? Hello, everyone. According to our forecast, the real GDP in this year is supposed to increase by 3.8%, next year by 3.5%, but this figure has deteriorated as compared to our previous forecast, and it's actually a result of losing our power generation. So a lot of generation capacities were damaged. So unlike 2022, 2023, when Russian troops attacked the transmission networks, now we lose in our generation capacities. And so the growth in this year and next year will strongly depend on how Ukraine is able to efficiently ensure power generation. We talk about modular stations, gas piston installations, renewable energy. All these factors will be truly important indeed. This is my first point. My second point is that in this years we're a bit more optimistic than our colleagues due to the fact that according to our estimates in first quarter the real GDP will increase by approximately 5%. And even if we talk about April, we expected 4 point something percent, in May 3.6%. So certain growth is accumulated over the course of 5 months. So this is which positively influence the annual growth trends. And so this is the reason why we stick to our 3.8% forecast. Oleksiy mentioned a very important point. The progress of war and hostilities will strongly affect the forecast, and the Ministry of Finance have already announced the review of budget to increase the defense budget allocations, and the question is how these expenses will be covered. This year we hope for foreign aid. But if we talk about growth by components, according to our assumptions, according to our forecast, our internal consumption, household consumption will increase by around 5% due to the growing wages, and the retirement benefits were indexed to this year, so it also influences our GDP. Also, we still observe a rapid increase in investments. Investments into various defense manufacturing capacities. This is similar to last year. It also positively affects the growth according to our assumptions, according to our forecast. I'm sorry, we are about to have negative contribution of export because import recovers faster than export. But thanks to the operation of Ukrainian seaports, Ukrainian sea corridors, the export is also growing. It's supposed to grow according to our forecasts, and also will be very important for Ukrainian economy. So the further growth next year will strongly depend on operation of sea corridor. We assume that it will continue to function and will help us to slightly increase our export next year as well. Still, we assume as Maria mentioned, there probably will be a chance to fund some expenses from foreign aid. So these are not the figures in IMF program right now. We know that IMF is not reviewing macro forecast right now, and in the memorandum they're about to sign, the financing need will still probably kept the same, but still we expect changes and we will see that the new figures will be closer to the forecast by non-governmental actors. And as for another key factors, I think my colleagues will mention later, it's labor resources, human capital. Our monthly surveys show that the key bottleneck for entities was a lack of qualified labor, of human capital. If we can address this issue, we see that the government is now launching the training and retraining program for women, and it's going to be another factor stimulating growth. Thank you so much, Oleksandra. I think we will get back to both topics of energy and topic of human capital. I'm strongly believe it. I think our colleagues will have a lot to say about it. And now I would like to start a discussion of our second core indicator, it's inflation, and here we have certain differences. We have official forecast average 8.4, it's from official sources, and 7.5, so lower forecast by market experts. Mr. Vitaliy Vavryshchuk, could you please comment on our inflation forecast, monetary policy, currency policy? What do you expect, and how do you understand this difference? Do you think is it a significant difference or not? Hello. Well, as for inflation, I don't think this difference is that large. Yes, of course, it's 1.52% difference, but take into account the high level of uncertainty we are talking about today. It's a totally acceptable dispersion of forecasts. And let me emphasize that the inflation we are observing right now is much lower than the inflation all of us forecasters, the national bank expected in the end of the last year. And it's a rapid slowdown of inflation rates has allowed the national bank to significantly soften the monetary policy. And right now we actually living in new realities, both in terms of interest rates and in terms of foreign exchange policy implemented by the National Bank of Ukraine. Last year, the National Bank reduced the interest rate from 25 to 15, but market interest rates responded quite moderately. But since March, since April, we have seen quite high sensitivity of market rates to the changes of the national bank's interest rate. So we also have witnessed significant mitigation of monetary policy. We all love these interest rates for deposits, but but these rates were too burdensome both for banks and for government, and it's nice that we having a kind of normalization of monetary policy here, and we are coming towards another point of equilibrium. I think by the end of summer we will reach a level which will be maintained for the next 12 months. Because right now we have limited opportunities to further soften the monetary policy. We can argue with the National Bank, is it possible to reduce the interest rate by another percent or 0.5%? But it's more about refinement and calibration. But in general, I think our capacity to soften the monetary policy is almost exhausted, and we are approaching the level which will be maintained for the next 12-18 months. As for currency policy, I think one of the largest achievements of the National Bank is the fact that it has dared to tolerate this moderate controlled hryvnia devaluation. Of course, NBU does not give us any references about any landmarks about this devaluation dynamics, but the general understanding prevailing on the market is that these movements are not going to be sharp. Most likely we will not witness any sharp fluctuations of the exchange rates over a short time. current devaluation rates do not result in any significant inconveniences for people, for private individuals, and for businesses. So I think here we are moving in the right direction. But of course, we all remember about huge imbalance of foreign accounts. These imbalances need to be closed, somehow covered, need to be treated. So here we all agree that the gradual hryvnia devaluation will continue. Thank you, Mr. Vitaliy Vavryshchuk, the head of Macroeconomic Research Department at the ICU Group, Ukrainian Investment Bank. Thank you so much for your presentation. And let's now talk about topic which truly concerns all of us, or I think all of our experts have mentioned that it's a budget gap and updated forecasts of the financing needs and the gap between financing need expected by the IMF and financing need forecasted on the average by our experts. It's 43 billions according to IMF and over 80 billions according to our experts. So it's a significant, it's still a very significant difference. And Miss Olena Bilan, Director of Research Department at Dragon Capital Investment Company, and she is also a member of a supervision board of our think tank, Center for Economic Strategy. So, Olena, the floor is yours, and other colleagues will also have a chance to briefly comment on other issues we have discussed today. So, by the end, I will expect you to raise your hands so we can continue our discussion. Olena, please, the floor is yours. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Maria. And as for financing needs from point of view of budget, I checked our old forecast 6 months ago, specifically our forecast, and our forecast has not changed. We still match the average level of all forecasts you have collected, and let me emphasize that this amount is significantly lower of 65, so this 53 billion is much lower than 63 billion covered last year. It's a significant reduction. We do not usually emphasize it, but it's also a very important point, and this reduction is possible due to reduction of a budget gap in dollar equivalent. Here we have several contributing factors, including hryvnia devaluation, mentioned by Mr. Vitaliy, which is happening in a very slow and gradual manner, thanks to a new regime of controlled flexibility used by the National Bank, and thanks to certain measures taken to increase the budget income part. This windfall tax for banks, for example, and other similar measures. I'm not talking about the state budget gap, but there is a great difference between state budget gap, which is often discussed by governmental officials from the Ministry of Finance. This is something they are directly responsible for, but we are economists, so we take a look at the budget gap from a more general perspective, which includes also local budget, social security fund, and the pension fund especially, because this indicator covers both the state finance and is representative for other components. But this reduction compared to previous year, it means that the funding needs are still very high, and the foreign aid is still critically important for us, both in this year and in the next year. This year we expect $37 billion of budget aid. It's not sufficient to fully cover our financing needs, but the financing need amount also includes planned repayment of internal and external debt, and it's quite a high amount. But a positive thing is that it's quite quite easy to attract from the internal market, so we can easily refund the spendings. And we actually, in addition to this 10 billions we need to repay, we expect the Ministry of Finance will be able to raise $6 billion extra in order to fully cover the financing needs. The financing needs this year, I don't know what about my colleagues, but we do not include here commercial debt payments. These payments, as per the schedule in this year, are estimated as $4.7 billion more, and these are mostly interests accumulated over the course of 2 years. Of 2 years of when they have been frozen, when these commercial debt payments have been frozen, and this agreement was reached in 2022. And why we don't include this amount? Because right now the government is negotiating another restructuring of this debt, and the parameters of this restructuring must meet the IMF debt resilience sustainability criteria. And the last data disclosed by the Ministry of Finance about this negotiation shows that right now parties have quite different positions. The government, taking into account the IMF debt sustainability criteria, suggests to write off over the half of commercial debt, while the total amount is $24 billion now. This is the amount they are which is a subject of current negotiations. So over the half of this amount is suggested to be written off by the government, and the government also suggests to postpone the repayment for 5-10 years and increase the IMF program payments, because right now there are more urgent needs, which is to fund the military. The creditor suggests softer terms, writing off of 20%, with the possibility to repay this amount, provided positive development of events. So basically, it means that right now parties have quite different positions in this regard. But the important thing here is that the parties publicly announced their commitment to achieve a compromise. The time frames for these negotiations are quite tight, but I personally believe that a compromise here can be achieved, and this compromise will be highly beneficial for Ukraine under the current conditions, because it's definitely not the best option to go into default, and further freezing is also not a solution for the debt sustainability issue. So I think until early August, these agreements will be reached. Thank you so much, Olena. Olena Bilan, Director of Research at Dragon Capital Investment Company. And about debt sustainability issue, I would like to continue this topic, and I'm now giving the floor to Evgeniya Sleptsova, head economist at Oxford Economics, read by many international company representatives. Evgeniya, what do you think about debt sustainability and this restructuring? Hello, everyone. Thank you, Maria. Let me comment on macroeconomic assumptions used as a foundation for creditors' suggestions and the government suggestions. So we have prepared very detailed estimation until 2030. And I was impressed by the fact that the basic scenario looks too optimistic, kind of upside scenario, because they expect the war to end in next year. Very low primary gap, increasing GDP, so-called post-war reconstruction begins. While downside negative scenario looks quite terrible, and from what I understand from rumors heard during the spring IMF meeting, the investors were quite shocked when during this conversation with IMF, someone mentioned that the negative scenario was quite seriously considered. They want this negative scenario to be included into restructuring terms. Our scenario is somewhere interim, is somewhere in between basic one and negative one. We definitely agree that the primary gap, while the wide continues, primary gap will be quite large because the GDP grows. We are more positive about it in a short-term perspective because while the war continues, we can't. The recession is impossible. The war economy supports the GDP growth as itself, but in a long-term perspective, let me remind you that that even before the full-scale invasion, Ukraine had been forecasted to lose 1 to 2% of labor force per year. So 3 to 4% growth was a very difficult even in that conditions. So the war further escalates the situation. Here we are quite negative about it. Inflation, GDP deflator, consumer inflation is higher, and it's helping in our case. Basically, like it works like inflate your debt concept. Higher inflation helps to cope with debt, and while we receive, and if we receive the Western aid, hryvnia will also most likely be stronger than as compared to IMF's negative scenario. So we are somewhere in the middle, and it's quite impressive is that this debt relief amount is huge. IMF estimates this as 50 billion for this whole period until 2030, and it's much higher than commercial debt. So the investors prefer to ignore this scenario because our money will be enough even if we write off all of them. So basically, it's more about internal debt. Sorry, let me remind you about the timing. You have 30 seconds. Yes, I'm finishing now. So we more tend to agree with the government's position, even if it's more positive than a bit more positive than we expected. And we're talking not about commercial debt. This restructuring may affect not just commercial debt. It will be really interesting to observe the progress of these negotiations in the future. Yes, indeed. It's quite a new procedure for us. We have never reached this point in our discussions before, so it's a fresh vision. Thank you so much. And now I would like to give floor to Mr. Oleksandr from Mr. Concorde Capital to discuss as forecast assumptions, what we have already mentioned, energy, lack of labor force, and in the same context, let's also talk about mobilization, drafting reservation, and then I will invite our colleague from Vienna Institute of Economic Research to talk about external market situation after that, and then I will give floor to our governmental representative. Oleksandr, please, the voice yours. Maria, thank you so much. If you don't mind, uh, I will also say a few words about debt restructuring, about debt relief. Basically, the key issue about private debt relief is interest rate used to calculate the rate used to calculate future cash flows. I believe our private creditors do not really understand the situation in Ukraine, and they want too much in some sense. They want to have future cash flows at a 20% rate, which is a bit too much, to be honest. And the second most important issue is this unconditional relief mentioned here. And if until now I hadn't believed that the creditors would accept this unconditional relief. Right now we have some hope because today's Ghana debt restructuring was announced. The Ghana's profile is very similar to Ukraine except for war. So today we have received information that creditors, private creditors have agreed to write off 37% of debt unconditionally, and it's truly inspiring. It's a very good argument for the Ministry of Finance to continue negotiations at their terms. As for GDP and assumptions, yes, indeed, we understand that the most painful, most burning matter for us is the situation on the energy market, situation with the lack of electricity, and situation with labor force. As for
Зараз ми бачимо, що ситуація, всі називають це репетицією до зими, так, і ми бачимо, що дефіцит в енергосистемі в залежності від погоди, часу доби і дня тижня
as for
складає там від
electricity,
0 до 30%. Моє таке базове припущення, що у нас є
it's something between 0 and
з
33%. And my basic
з
assumption that we have a good chance to complete repair operations to launch a heat cogeneration in winter and to reach a more moderate level of deficit between 10 and 20%. Well, it's obvious if it will significantly depend on the situation with missile strike. Then once again, this winter we will most likely have the deficit, and this deficit will affect the economic recovery. But for now, it doesn't look too scary. On one hand, we indeed have some industries where the situation is binary. They either work when they either operate when they have power or don't operate at all when the power supply is intermittent. It's a problem indeed. But on the other hand, the share of such manufacturing sites in the total production, in the total GDP is rather low because most such manufacturing sites have already significantly reduced their output. And so the only question is, are they going to resume their production or are they going to wait longer? And another positive thing is that this lack potential deficit of power will definitely encourage investments. In terms of investment, we will definitely have a significant increase as compared to what we could expect last year because we see new businesses switching to own generation, small businesses switching to own generations, and large businesses are also actively investing in their energy independence. And I think it's something which may which may balance the negative influence of potentially expected blackouts. So I think that increase between 2 and 4% is something quite realistic, taking into account our positive and negative side, negative points related to blackouts. And as for labor resources, we have many research results conducted both by government and by business entities that potential increase of mobilization may be quite problematic, but on the other hand, we are observing an active propaganda of this problematic nature for businesses. But on the other hand, we understand that it happens in order to actively advocate for this idea of economic reservations. From my point of view, we do indeed have an issue with labor force, but in most cases it can be solved, and it's definitely not going to have any catastrophic influence, any significant influence on the forecasts we have seen at the beginning of our session. Thank you so much, Oleksandr, and let's finish this round of communications with economists and forecasters who have shared their forecasts for the small consensus opinion with Olga Pindyuk, economist from Vienna Institute of Economic Research. Olga, could you please tell us a bit about external factors, what we can expect, and what should we be concerned about? Well, unfortunately, I'm afraid that this final part is not going to be quite optimistic. It's going to be rather pessimistic, because today, in external situation, we see more risks, more negative factors than positive ones. We all know how difficult it was for United States to approve the last tranche of military support, and it was only a preview of what could happen if Donald Trump wins the elections in September, because there is a consensus opinion about Trump's policy, provided he wins elections. The United States support for Europe will reduce significantly, and Ukraine may suffer a lot from his political games. And another negative aspect is the operation or the function of EU institutions. The last G7 decision on $10 billion for Ukraine from future income from seized Russian assets was a very positive signal, but there are many buts, many barriers to implementation of this decision. European Union is expected to indefinitely maintain the status of seized Russian assets, and here Hungary can be a constant source of troubles, and it's quite difficult to find a way out of these situations. Also, our news are talking a lot about a kind of legal way to bypass Hungary to pay the first tranche out of this future amount is good, but it's not yet finalized, and it doesn't mean that the future decision on this $50 billion will be positive. So external support, which is actually a core for our survival, the survival of Ukrainian economy in the next year, and for Ukrainian capacity to actively defend the battlefield, is not sufficiently strong and may weaken even further. So these are core negative factors for our forecast. And as for future reconstruction, here we are more optimistic in our views. We expect capital to come in if we have these guarantees, if we have security guarantees, or as part of NATO framework offered to Ukraine, or maybe some alternative guarantees, then the capital will flow in, because last year Ukraine interestingly interesting was a leader in terms of foreign investment increase. If we compare it with it's in comparison with the baseline in 2022, but it's an impressive tendency. It's a very positive thing, and I want to finish with this positive thing. Thank you for this positive completion. We really need positive expectations right now. And now I would like to give a floor to representatives of our official institutions. Today we have Mr. Karlis Smits from Economic Policy Program of the World Bank in Eastern Europe and leading economist. We also have Sergiy Nikolaychuk, Deputy Head of the National Bank of Ukraine, who's responsible for monetary policy, and Mr. Roman Lysenko, the head of expert group on macroeconomic forecasting at the Strategic Planning Directorate at the Ministry of Finance of Ukraine. Basically, the key consumer of macroeconomic forecasts and author of forecasts which are used as a foundation for budget planning. Then I will offer each of you a minute to share some of your reflections. And for now, I'm giving the floor to Mr. Karlis Smits, the director of the World Bank Policy Program in Eastern Europe. So what are some of the World Bank's expectations for this year, for next year's? How they're similar and how they're different to what you've heard today? And would you like to comment something on it?
Yes, thank you for this opportunity and to hear the views from Ukraine. I think it's important to listen to the researchers who are on the ground, particularly this is very important also for international organizations. A few kind of observations and how we kind of also kind of think about the growth going forward. Number one, growth is obviously there's a lot of uncertainty which is beyond the control of the government and also beyond the other policymakers. So obviously it is very difficult to make kind of projections in that kind of environment. The first conclusion is that we share the view that it is kind of a risks and kind of economic outlook has worsened, particularly due to the kind of recent attacks on the critical energies. So this is shared. The second kind of an important aspect for economic growth, it relies on abilities of the government and also the national bank to maintain macroeconomic stability. This is kind of a precondition for any kind of a growth to occur. And this is going to be very important going forward. For macro stability, what it is important to maintain steady flow of international resources to cover a fiscal deficit, but also the balance of payment needs. And we have seen so far, these have been addressed. In a particularly resources from the donors have been slightly more than kind of a balance of payment needs. So that's kind of also kind of resulted in increase in buffers in exchange reserves. So it is yet to be seen whether that's kind of continues down the road. But I think that's one is and there's a lot of discussion about how to get that going forward. The second assumption, not assumption, but kind of a conclusion, it's very important to have this separating between what happens in a short term, which is more difficult as to what happens to kind of Ukraine's potential output. So what is very important to kind of note that also kind of NBU's kind of analysis shows that the output gap is rapidly closing. And this is one of the kind of testament of the resilience of Ukraine's economy, that it is kind of a coat with these kind of low-hanging fruits, addressing disruptions, also kind of innovative ways to access external markets. So that kind of a low-hanging fruit is kind of a closing quite significantly. And what is this challenge? The third one is going forward, Ukraine is going to be constrained by the so-called supply side, which is kind of a both kind of its potential growth, and that is the kind of a key challenge for Ukraine, because you need to have a high growth, not only kind of for your incomes, but also the EU convergence. And if you look at the supply side, there are a lot of kind of constraints in a short term and long term. Labor was kind of and energy was kind of discussed, but the other kind of constraint also for the supply side is access to the external markets. So we see that EU is one of the largest kind of markets in Ukraine, but the access to the EU market is constrained by kind of logistics, which we also kind of mentioned, but also on the policy side. EU is kind of formally opening the market, but there's kind of many non-tariff barriers, a lot of uncertainty. These opening to the EU market is limited, for example, to a year. There are certain categories of the products that were kind of impose quotas. You know what happened to the grain. So this is going to be very significant. When we think about the potential output, which is kind of quite important, the labor market issues need to be kind of considered. There's a lot of talk about the reform matrix and what donors are asking for Ukraine to do. If you look at these, all the 200 measures, very little of these measures relate to the labor market. Ukraine's labor code still has elements of the kind of Soviet times, participation of women, veterans is also kind of constrained by these very stringent labor market regulations, labor codes. So this is kind of important. And finally, obviously, productivity is kind of one of kind of aspects. As a World Bank, we usually kind of, and you have seen it also in IMF, we do not comment on military kind of outlook, etc. But it's becoming increasingly we recognize, and everybody recognizes, this air defense is one of the most critical, of very critical importance for economic activity. While we don't have a control of what is going to happen with the nature of the war, these examples of that provision of air defense in a very critical areas is very crucial for economic growth. We have seen what happens in the big cities, and particularly on a critical infrastructure like energy. So this is a very important that we want to kind of stress and call for other countries to provide not only financial resources, but air defense, because this is a very important aspect for economic growth and viability. Thank you.
Thanks, Million, for this, because something from the World Bank, this is really powerful. And we also heard this message a lot in Berlin conference as well. That the air defense is vital for the survival and economic growth as well. Тепер я переходжу на українську.
Now I will switch back to Ukrainian, and I would like to give the floor to Mr. Sergiy Nikolaychuk, Deputy Head of the National Bank of Ukraine. I know that you're about to review your forecast, but you haven't yet reviewed it. As long as I know, could you please tell me a bit about your plans and maybe share some of your reflections about what you've heard today? Thank you so much. Traditionally, we review in our forecast 4 times a year, and the next review is scheduled in late July. Right now, we rely on the figures from our April forecast, and we estimate the risks for it based on various factors. And here, let me reflect on the forecast you have collected and presented today from various organizations, and to compare them with the forecast by the National Bank of Ukraine. Let me start with this year economic growth forecast. Actually, we expect that the economy will increase by 3%. It's matching this range of 0.5–4% range expected by various organizations, so it's not something new. I totally agree with Oleksandra and with Karlis. who talked in detail about crucial factors for economic growth this year. First of all, it's a battlefield situation. It's our capacity to protect our businesses and population from terrorist Russian airstrike. It's a situation with our energy sector, and also, which is really important, it's the influence of mobilization and migration on Ukrainian labor potential. Here, if we compare our April 3% growth forecast with the current situation, I think the risks are prevailing and our forecast is about to deteriorate. But in some sense, these risks are balanced by quite a positive situation during the first months of this year as compared to our previous estimates. And if we talk about the supply constraints existing today, I also agree with what was mentioned by previous speakers, especially since in the energy sectors, the investment into uninterrupted, into continuous operations by businesses, by local authorities, by government at national levels may result in a short-term impulse for growing economic activities this year and to eliminate some of the mitigate some of the supply constraints. It's also really important to address the supply constraints related to labor force and to take various steps to engage more women and try other economic policy options. As for inflation forecast, here I agree with Vitaliy that our forecasts are not that different today, taking into account the traditional volatility of inflation process in Ukraine. Over the course of the last few months, the general inflation has been a bit lower than consensus forecasts. But if we take a look at the general inflation trends, the basic inflation trends, the actual situation is quite close to what was expected by the analysts earlier this year. Another important point to highlight is the budget gap forecast and the financing forecast. It was heavily discussed today, and I also want to share some of my reflections. Maria, your phrase about this large gap between estimates by our analysts and by IMF. The actual thing here it's more about definition of this budget need. Olena mentioned it slightly, but it's very important to realize it quite clearly, because if we estimate budget needs as budget gap plus repayment of external debt, it will result in a figure used by IMF of $43 billion. But if we also add repayment of internal debt plus the 10 billion United States dollars, we actually reach our budget needs of 53 billions mentioned by most analysts. So there is not much difference between these estimates, but it's really important for us to be on the same page and use similar definitions. And finally, if we talk about closing this gap, then, as we mentioned in our April forecast, it's absolutely realistic task, taking into account the international aid expected this year, 38 billion mentioned in this forecast, and the capacities of external market to fund and the internal market to fund the budget gap, the success demonstrated by the Ministry of Finance with the support of the National Bank last year, and the figures we expect in this year. What else? Well, about external sector, when we take a look at the forecasts in the International Reserve forecasts, we also don't have much difference between various forecasts. Everyone expects international reserves at the similar levels. The national banks expect them. So here we are quite close to each other. We see a potential for to mitigate this trade disbalances, current account disbalances. So we expect to mitigate, to cover them from the international aid, and the situation will be quite comfortable for the national bank. So we will have a certain buffer to ensure the stability of the currency market. And let me also bring your attention to another point. During your presentation, Maria stressed that the highest difference is now about the current account gap. But I think it mostly reflects the differences in methods, very different approaches to how to classify the funds from the United States of America. For example, in our April forecast, we classified these funds as a loan, which contributed to increase of the current account gap as compared to our previous estimates when we were expecting these funds in form of grants, and we put them on the positive side of the current account. But right now, both IMF and the Ministry of Finance classify this loan as a contingency. So we once again can interpret these funds, understand these funds as a grant and consider them as a part of the current account. It's just my suggestion for future when we are going to analyze the external trends. Maybe we should focus more not on the current account, but on a foreign trade, which is a more homogeneous indicator to be assessed by different organizations, different analysts, so we can have a more harmonized vision in the external sector. I think I will finish here. If you have any additional questions, you are welcome. Thank you so much, Sergiy. For the second year in a row, in all analytical reports, we have our official budget gap with asterisks, which doesn't include grants. Now we will have current accounts with double asterisks, depending on the classification of the foreign aid proceeds. It's a wartime economy, wartime finance. It's very interesting. If we have enough time, we may talk about how these 50 billions from seized Russian assets are going to be reflected in the current account, how to do it. But it belongs to the next year forecast. Sergey, would you like to respond to it? Yes. Let me reflect about this topic. Let me respond to this quite pessimistic picture described by Olga about foreign financing. If we actually take a look at our forecast, then as compared to April, when we shared our macroeconomic forecast, I think the situation with external funding now looks better as compared to April. Yes, of course, in order to get this 40 billion euro, which where the countries have already politically committed to provide. It still requires further technical and diplomatic work, but still the progress in securing this financing for Ukraine is obvious and is very significant. And we actually mentioned it in our press release following our monetary meeting in June. This risk related to international financing, in my opinion, they have decreased significantly as compared to what we had a few months ago. Thank you.
Дякую дуже, Сергію.
Could you please, let's can I briefly reflect on it? You will have a chance to reflect on it at the end. I will give floor to you for reflections because we have many people but very limited time. And now I would like to give a floor to Mr. Roman Lysenko. He is a leader of expert group on macroeconomic forecasting at the strategic planning directorate of the Ministry of Finance of Ukraine, and he's actually a key consumer of all of everything we have discussed here today. A traditional question for Mr. Roman, similar to what I've asked our previous speakers. Could you please reflect on what you've heard today, and could you specifically focus on the things mentioned by a few analysts today? There is a chance of state budget review if for 2024. What do you think about it? And could you please tell us a little bit about the progress on midterm budget forecast for 2025? If you can, could you please comment on it? We will highly appreciate it. Please, Mr. Hello, dear colleagues. Thank you so much for having me. Let me start with your final question. Today we are working on budget declaration indicators as per requirements of the budget code and the resolution on forecast preparation 621. We have launched the process of governmental forecast development. We expect that very soon the budget declaration and the forecast will be considered, and the macroeconomic indicators demonstrated today, they are quite tight, and they demonstrate that the expert community and the governmental bodies are more or less on the same page in terms of viewing the situation in the country. It's true both for GDP and for CPI. The only question is about foreign exchange rate, but it's a disputable question. It's about vision. In general, the economy functions under the conditions of high uncertainty. We witness rapid changes of internal and external conditions, which definitely affects the economic forecasting process, which happens in a real-time mode, basically. So if I talk about the main macro prognosis itself, it's more the competence of the Ministry of Economy as the authorized governmental body responsible for this governmental forecast, but this extreme uncertainty in terms of security risks makes us consider different scenarios. So we have a high uncertainty around our energy system, the destruction of our generating capacities, problems with export logistics, etc. And so these security risks significantly affect our future prospects and economic development opportunities in our country, including in the budget sphere. Still, the government is doing its best in order to maintain the economy. We don't have any other economic midterm and long-term prospects other than integration with the European Union. So the government is doing its best to ensure the economic recovery after our victory. After security risks reduce, the reforms are being planned to improve the business conditions, reduce regulatory barriers, further digitalization, etc. So which to encourage Ukrainian manufacturers to continue to do their work and implement innovative technologies. We really hope to achieve it. And as for budget review, Most likely, the Ministry of Finance considers different scenarios, and the possibility of review will depend on a number of both internal and external factors. Thank you so much. One extra question for you. Can you share with us your vision of military scenarios you consider when you develop midterm budget declaration? Unfortunately, I cannot share this data, but we consider various scenarios, various possibilities, depending not just on security risks, but also on funding. And also, let me add that we need to take into account not just direct losses caused by the war, but also secondary effects such as demographic issues, a return of immigrants, mobilization, demobilization, veteran reintegration, and other issues related to these tasks to addressing these challenges. I'm really sorry I'm abusing my moderator authority, but since we expect Ukraine to soon join the EU, I know that under European midterm budget planning forecasting framework, there is something mentioned today by analysts. The EU forecast is part of budget declaration, not only the state budget deficit, but also this wide public finance gaps, such as Social Security Fund budget. Are you going to do something similar in the budget declaration? Yes, this year. Unfortunately, I'm not ready to comment on it. Thank you so much. You're welcome, and thank you for having me. Thank you so much, Mr. Roman. And now we approaching the last part of our today's event. And we don't have much questions in our Q&A section and in our chat. So our audience has a chance to ask the questions while CST. Olga, Pindyuk raising your hand, and dear colleagues, you have 1 minute each to reflect what you've heard. Olga, thank you so much. I just want to make sure that I'm properly understood. I'm not saying that now the situation is worse than in April, but we must not overestimate the achievements, basically the achievements which are possible thanks to the titanic, huge efforts of Ukrainian diplomacy. It's too early to relax for now. And the decision of this 50 billion was made, yes, but it doesn't mean that the next year and the next 2 years the financing needs and the military support needs will be met. Because if Trump wins presidential elections, we need we will have large issues with maintaining our military and defense potential just because we don't have production capacities. And I haven't even touched the issue of this global confrontation between West and East, where Russia and China are gaining more weight on the global arena, are reaching new agreements. This is also a very serious risk which makes the Western world to make some trouble, so to say. Thank you so much. Thank you, Olga. So, questions. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free and join the discussion. Okay, Oleksandra, let me ask the first question, and then I will give floor to Oleksandra. So, are you planning to engage immigrant employees? Can it create do you plan to attract migrant workers? what can contribute to economic growth? Oleksandra, would you like to answer this question? I wanted to discuss it, to talk about different topic, but about migrants. While we have an active war, it's very difficult to talk about attraction of migrants. If we take a look at the migration strategy developed by the Ministry of Social Policy, we mostly planning to attract migrant talents, people who can help Ukraine to develop, create something in Ukraine. And we need to focus on bringing back Ukrainian migrants, those who have left the country, and also those who have left the country a long time ago. So right now, we mostly focus on these areas, but before the full-scale invasion, the labor productivity in Ukraine was quite low. So if we're about to have investments, and we expect investments after the war, we won't need the same number of people as before, but we truly hope that Ukrainians will come back with new skills, with new training, people who know how to adapt to new conditions, flexible people. It will be truly helpful for Ukraine. And during this Berlin conference, the skill alliance agreement signed is going to be truly helpful for Ukraine, because we're talking about continuous professional development of Ukrainian professionals, both in Ukraine and abroad. The skills are much needed here, because we haven't mentioned the unemployment topic, but structural unemployment is quite high nowadays. So engaging new skills, new qualified labor force will be truly helpful to address the issues faced by the business today. And I wanted to partially address the question about midterm budget planning, the IMF program and Ukraine facility plan. Requires the government to approve the declaration for the year 25-27 in the next few days. We really wait for this decision. Its decision is supposed to be finalized because it's required by two obligatory documents for Ukraine, and it's a mandatory prerequisite for funding from EU and IMF. So I think we will have a positive decision, but let me use this chance to mention that on Thursday we're about to have a consortium together with the Analytics and Advocacy Institute, where we will present our estimate of IMF and EU program fulfillment. And answering another question about utility bills, we expect partial increase of bills later this year. Okay, you already answered this question from Q&A, and say another question in the chat. Consensus opinion. What is your consensus opinion about the end of the war? Well, we all assume that the war will definitely continue throughout 2024. We haven't even asked this question to analysts. If some of our colleagues want to share your expectations about the end of the war, you're welcome to raise your hand. If you have any expectations about approximate time frames of ending this war, yes, look, we all are economists, we are not military experts. So this is the reason why we can discuss only what's within our competence. Another question from Olena Kozlovska. European partners insist on implementation of midterm budget planning. We have already discussed it today. We will focus more on it. We will definitely talk about it. Marina, please message me and I will tell you more about our current projects we are implementing in this regard. Evgeniya, would you like to comment on something? I just want to add that we are forced right now to plan up to the year 2050, 2060, and we are supposed to have some assumptions on when the war is about to end, and my assumption is that if it still continues, it may still continue in 2026, but in 2027 we already expect the growth of investments, more active growth of investments. This is the kind of estimate we are supposed to have. Yes, thank you. Well, I truly hope that your forecast is too late because Ukraine really needs to win this war as soon as possible. We don't have we have so much resilience to withstand it for such a long time. Yes, many people in the world are saying these nice words about our resilience, but this resilience is not limitless. So it's really important to communicate that we need this military support to finish this war. It's truly important. I see we don't have any other questions in Q&A. We have also responded to all the questions in the chat, including external borrowing questions, inflations. I've already responded in writing and shared the link to our presentation. So we have just a minute for some of your last reflections, and then we will wrap up our meeting. Of course, if you want to share something or comment on something, you're welcome. Please raise your hand, and I will give floor to you. Oleksandra, please. Yes, I just want to once again emphasize on what Karlis mentioned. Our economic development strongly depends on our air defense and F-16. The defense industry is crucial here in this regard. The military assistance is truly important for now, and it's important, even more important than financial support. This 50 billion from Russian assets and subsequent aid will strongly depend on how fast our international partners may develop these mechanisms, because the support approved by the America a few months ago is not yet here, and we don't know if we're about to have any conditions under or how we're about to receive this fund. It's also something we have discussed in our NGO group. Should we even add this money to our forecast? Is it a loan? Is it a grant? Is it a gratuitous support? We don't know when this money is about to arrive. So it's also an important question. Thank you so much, Oleksandra. Then, thank you so much, dear colleagues, for joining us. Dear audience, let me remind you that today we have the best leading macroeconomic analyst from Ukraine. I could reach from private sector, from analytic company, from Concorde Capital, from Dragon Capital, from VII, from Forbes, from Institute for Economic Research and Political Consultations. I see you in Oxford Economics. We also highly appreciate the Ministry of Finance, the World Bank, and the National Bank of Ukraine for sharing your perspectives and views, for your care, for caring after the fate of Ukraine, for joining these discussions. This event is arranged as part of Good Government's Fund, Economic Hub, boosting economic sustainability through efficient governmental finance governance, funded by the United Kingdom government, implemented by Up Global and the Center for Economic Strategy. I wish you all a safe night, and thank you so much.